Enjoy. Thank you.
Okay. So, Anushka told you she spent 3 years trying to get me here. I don't think that even in Slovenian she told you what she did to me last night. She took me up to the castle, into a restaurant, where we had a meal, and the important thing is that it involved consuming 5 different kinds of Slovenian wine. And therefore, this afternoon, I am, to use a technical term, completely fucked. And so, it could be quite difficult to talk to you for an hour. It's actually going to be difficult to stand up for an hour, but I'm going to do my best. Okay, so, you're all journalists. Let's try and talk about the technique of what we do. But if we take a step back from it, journalism, specifically reporting, is a very strange kind of profession. Because on the face of it, what we do is ridiculously simple. We ask people questions, we tell another bunch of people the answers. And you could say, well, there are no skills in that at all. There is no technique. It's just so simple. But in fact, I think there are skills which are really quite subtle. But because they're subtle, you can't be definite about it. So it's quite interesting. I travel around quite a lot. I've often run classes for journalists, trying to talk to them about technique. And for example, I went to China. I thought, these Chinese journalists are utterly different from me. Their culture, their history, their media law, their political context. And yet the weird thing was that within 5 minutes of talking to those Chinese journalists, we were all talking the same language, so to speak, because all of us confront the same problems and all of us struggle to find solutions. The reason I'm saying this to you is I'm going to tell you how I work, but I do not want to assume that what I'm doing is right. What I do is my attempt to solve the subtle problems of being a reporter. You will have found your own ways, and I was trying to get them in this room so that we could have the lights up on you, because I quite like it if people interrupt and tell me how they do things. But you understand, I'm not claiming to be better than any other reporter. It's just my particular way of doing things. So I'm going to talk about technique. But just before I do that, let me just talk about what's happening with news organizations globally and in particular in the UK. 2 things, really. The first was that years ago, I wrote a book. It's called Flat Earth News. The idea of the title is that we produce news stories which very frequently are like the idea that the Earth is flat. Everybody can see that the Earth is flat. It's perfectly obvious that the Earth is flat. But if you check, the truth turns out to be different. It was perfectly obvious. We all told the world that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. None of us seem to have checked. And months later, when it was all too late, we discovered all those stories that all those news organizations all over the planet had put out were false. So why do we do that? And the interesting thing is people outside our profession think that they know very well why so many stories turn out to be false or distorted or propaganda. They think that we are puppets, mindless slaves of our proprietors, and that these proprietors tell us what to do, and that obediently we carry out their wishes and tell whatever lies they want. Now, of course, it's true that media proprietors do sometimes abuse their position and try to force journalists who work for them to put out stories that aren't true. But my experience, I'd be interested to hear yours, is that it happens rather rarely, certainly not as often as people outside our profession believe. What we're actually suffering from is something different, something more worrying, a structural weakness. And historically, certainly in Britain, this was brought about, first of all, by corporations who noticed that news organizations were making a lot of money. So these huge corporations came in and bought up newspapers and changed the logic of the way that news organizations were working. Instead of being there to try to tell the truth about important things, it became that we were there to try to make profit for these greedy corporations. And these corporations reduced the staff because that reduced their costs, increased the output so that we were writing for websites as well as newspapers. If it was radio and television, we're turning out news 24 hours a day. Fewer people doing more work. When I was doing this book, Flat Earth News, we did a very simple piece of research. We went to the newspaper museum. And we got out copies of the newspapers that had been published for the last 20 years, and we took a tape measure, and we measured the editorial space that was being filled in these newspapers. And then we went to the company reports of the companies who owned the newspapers to track the number of journalists that they were employing. And the amount of space they were filling was increasing over the years. The number of journalists who were filling that space was reducing. The bottom line was that in a 20-year period, it turned out that journalists were having to fill 3 times as much space as they were 20 years earlier. And if you turn that around, it meant that story by story, a crude average, journalists had only a third of the time to spend on each story. And if you take time away from journalists, it's like taking the wood away from a carpenter. We can't do our work without time. And the result of that showed up. We did a big piece of research. We took 2,000 stories from the very best newspapers in Britain, not the shit sheet tabloids, the quality press. And I got some researchers from a university to analyze them. So first, if you think about what we do, our job is to try to tell the truth. Therefore, our function is to check. So how many of these 2,000 stories showed evidence that they had been checked? So you know the answer you'll get. It'll be 100%. That's what journalists do. The answer was not 100%. This is the best newspapers in Britain. The answer was 12% of the stories showed signs of being checked. This starts to tell you what happens when you take time away from journalists. And then the other question they asked in relation to these 2,000 stories, where have they come from? Where's the information come from? So the answer you would expect is, well, the journalist has gone out, found people to talk to, found raw material, put together the story. But when they looked, the answer was that with 8% of the stories, we couldn't quite tell. The answer actually where journalists were getting their own material themselves was the same figure, 12%. 80% of the material in these stories was second-hand. It came from news agencies like Reuters and the world of public relations, PR, both highly unreliable. The people who work for Reuters may be good and brave. They have no idea what's going on in the world. They don't cover the world. It's a tiny organization compared to everything that's going on the planet. They don't know. If we rely on them, we don't know either. And the PR world, they exist to serve the corporate, commercial, political, personal interests of the people who employ them. So even if they're telling the truth, it may not be the truth that we should be looking at, and sometimes, of course, they'll lie. You put this together, these organizations being starved of their resources, and we're sitting there recycling second-hand material without checking it. And then, of course, you can see why we said there were weapons of mass destruction all over Iraq. It wasn't that we were lying, it was simply we had no idea what the truth was, but we kept banging out the stories. And that seems to me to be the shape that we're in, that we're fighting against. And that book was written 6 or 7 years ago. The internet has made this problem far worse by taking our readers and our advertisers and reducing our resources. So you can tell me if I'm wrong. Maybe Slovenia is different, but my experience is all over the developed world, journalists, good people, are now being made to do bad work by organizations which will not allow them to do their job properly. So that's the first thing. That's the core of that book, Flat Earth News. You'll notice a small triumph here. I'm still standing. I need water. Okay. The second thing I did, which is I wanted to tell you about the media in Britain, was this thing I've spent the last 6 years working on, which is the phone hacking scandal. And this is about it's a wonderful story, actually. I just want to do a little detour. Some of you in the room saw Vlad's presentation of the Yanukovych leaks earlier. This is a story about how the president of Ukraine flees, and journalists go to his residence and find that he's dumped wonderful files full of material in the sea just beyond his official residence. And these journalists rescue them and dry them out. And then, as I said to Vlad afterwards, it's like an orgy of information. It's just fantastically good fun being a journalist because you're allowed to expose masses and masses of truth and cause masses of trouble. Really good fun. The phone hacking story has been a little bit like that in Britain. To begin with, it's a story about journalists behaving badly. It's about the fact that on one of Rupert Murdoch's newspapers, the News of the World, but also on many other popular newspapers in Britain, for years, journalists had been hiring private investigators to do illegal things to get the information for their stories. So they were hacking, listening into voicemail messages that were left on their targets' mobile phones. Very senior politicians or celebrities or sports figures, anybody. So hacking into the voicemail messages. They were hacking into computers and email messages. You can buy these programs to do that. You send somebody an email, it looks innocent, they open the program, you know this stuff. So they were hacking voicemail, hacking email. They were routinely bribing police officers, prison officers, civil servants, all illegal payments. To a smaller extent, they were involved in burglaries, actually breaking into people's houses to get, or using the private investigators to break into houses to get material, breaking into cars. I mean, it's straightforward criminal activity. And you can see how that's intimately linked to those resource problems I was talking about in Flat Earth News, that if you don't give journalists enough time to do their stories properly, and you put immense pressure on them, you've got to get a big story, we've got to sell this newspaper, you get that kind of activity erupting. But what makes that story worth covering is that it also takes you straight into the world of power, because Rupert Murdoch owns 4 newspapers and a television news channel just in the UK. He has immense power. So from the outset, we could see that the police were aware of all this crime, and yet they failed to investigate. So we get inside all that about what was going on inside the police. And then taking it a step further, the same pattern with our government, that they were failing to act as a democratic government should because of their fear of Rupert Murdoch and his newspapers. This fear, you can see, is built of 2 things. First, there is an organizational fear that if his newspapers start to attack my political party or my corporation, is this still working, or my trade union, it will those newspapers can destabilize the life of my organization, so that every day our agenda is kicked sideways because they've printed some front-page story. If they find out we're having an internal debate, they present it as a split. If they find out we've got some problem, they present it as a crisis. It can ruin governments. But then there's also an individual fear. Those newspapers specialize in investigating the personal lives, the sex lives of public figures. And that's a very frightening, humiliating, painful thing when it happens. And because of that fear of those 2 different kinds, the Murdoch company in Britain had enormous power. And by following through from investigating the crimes by the journalists, we got into all that with chaotic effect. Okay, so I'm just telling you that as background, just so that we can kind of see how fucked up our world is. All right, now I want to talk about technique. What I want to say is that, as a big headline, that although these skills that we use are subtle and a bit weird, at the end of the day, there's nothing magical about doing big investigations and causing trouble. So if you come to the first thing, ask about how do we find stories? So again, if you go outside our profession, how do journalists find stories? Well, then people understand that we get our stories from contacts, these mysterious people in dark overcoats in the corners of multi-story car parks. Of course, that's bullshit. We get most of our stories from Reuters and PR material. I want to argue there's a different way of approaching it. So, in the last 3 or 4 years, I've been involved in 2 stories which went global, which became huge. One was working with Julian Assange and WikiLeaks in the second half of 2010, publishing all those American military and diplomatic secrets. And the other is the phone hacking scandal, which has had enormous effects in Britain. And the point is that I want to make is that there's a very, very simple way of finding stories like these. And it's to do with training your mind to work in a slightly bizarre way. So ordinary human beings go about their lives and they see this and they see that and they move on. Journalists are more weird than that. We have to train ourselves so that we notice the tiny things that don't quite make sense, the tiny things that don't fit. If you have your picture of the world as you expect it to be, we notice the things that are slightly out of place. And we go, hang on a minute, this is not right. There's something missing here. I call this having a hang on a minute moment. Are you with me? Are you understanding my English? Sorry about speaking this foreign language. So you come back to if we start with the phone hacking saga, and just bear in mind what I've been saying about that. I've spent 6 years working on this. It's had enormous effects in Britain. It starts with a very simple thing. I'll tell you the story properly. So in about November 2005, Prince William went out to do something sporting and manly, of the kind that good princes do. And he hurt his knee. So he telephoned to the mobile phone of one of his secretaries and said, "I've hurt the royal knee. I may need to see the royal doctor." So, now, what he didn't know, but we now know, was that from the Office of the News of the World, the royal editor was in the habit of hacking into the voicemails of the staff at the Prince's palace. So he heard this message being left. Now, he understood very well that what he was doing was illegal. And so when he wrote stories that were based on these voicemail messages he had hacked, he always changed the facts a little bit to cover his tracks. So he wrote a story that said, "Oh, Prince William hurt his knee last week and went to see the doctor." Because all he had actually heard was that the prince wanted to see the doctor. Now, this was no ordinary knee, it was a royal knee, and so it recovered on its own without the need for any help from a doctor. So the story was wrong. So the palace said, "That is weird. William didn't see the doctor. How could he possibly have got that idea? It has to be the voicemail messages." So they called in the police. Now you understand, I've talked to you about Rupert Murdoch's power. There are not very many people in Britain who have more power and more prestige than Rupert Murdoch. William and his family happen to be one of those few groups. So the police say, "Okay, we'll investigate." And they investigated. They charged the royal editor who'd been listening to Prince William's voicemail. They said, "Okay, you've committed a criminal offence. You're going for trial." And they discovered that he had been working with a private investigator. "Okay, you're going to trial." So one reporter, one private investigator. Now, here's the point I'm trying to make about how we train ourselves to think. This isn't difficult, it's rather obvious, but when they came to trial, there's the royal editor, and he's charged with listening to the voicemail of 3 different staff from the palace, okay? And the private investigator is charged with the same thing, the same 3 victims. But the investigator is also charged with 5 other victims of voicemail hacking. An actor, a politician, a showbiz agent. Hang on a minute. What's going on here? Clearly, he listened to the royal messages, this investigator, because the royal editor wanted him to. But why would he listen to these other 5 people? Hang on a minute. Is he perhaps doing it for a hobby? I think not. Is he perhaps responding to strange voices in his head? Possible, but unlikely. When you have your hang on a minute moment, the next thing you do is to use the most powerful weapon that reporters have, which is our imagination. Careful here, I'm not saying we can imagine what we like and stick it in the newspaper, but we use imagination as a tool over and over again. What could the truth possibly be? That question is the way into almost any investigation that you're running. What could the truth possibly be? Could it be that other people at this newspaper are involved in this crime, and that the police have chosen to make an example of the private investigator, but not to go after the journalists? So that's where that story comes from, that way of training yourself to think in a particularly sensitive way. There's something wrong here, there's something missing. Here's what my imagination says. Now we go out and check. And when we go out and check, we discover that it isn't just the royal editor who's involved. The editor himself was involved. In fact, he's gone to prison for it. In fact, he comes out of prison on Sunday. And 4 news editors, and another person on the phone hacking. This was a systematic criminal operation. And the police, we now know, had all of the evidence of this in their hands at the point when they said there's only 1 reporter and only 8 victims. Oh, 8 victims? Time goes forward. Actually, there were 5,500. And they had the evidence of all that in their hands as well. Okay, but so this story, which has caused such repercussions, starts with this very simple process. So again, I'm not saying I'm right, but I'm just telling you how I do it. I constantly train my mind like a muscle to really notice everything that doesn't fit. There's something missing here, there's something wrong here, and then put in your imagination and pursue it. So a bigger story than that was Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And this is interesting because it combines flat earth news with this little bit of technique I'm talking about. So, it's May 2010. I've been working on the phone hacking for quite a while. It had gone quiet. So I'm sitting at home where I work from, with loud music playing and my feet on the desk. In the office, they think I'm working away. But anyway, and I'm reading The Guardian, Britain's finest newspaper. And there's a story in there, and it says effectively, the Americans have arrested one of their own soldiers. It names him, a man called Bradley Manning. And they have accused this Bradley Manning of leaking a colossal quantity of secrets to some weird Australian called Julian Assange, who has this organization called WikiLeaks. Now, if you go back to May 2010, Julian and WikiLeaks had been operating for, I think, 4 years. And they were somewhat known, but they certainly weren't famous. I had heard of them, but I'd never dealt with them. Okay, so there is the story. Classically, this story is running on Reuters. And there it is in The Guardian and The Times, and newspapers all over the world are carrying this thing. But nobody's doing the thing they need to do, which is to go, hang on a minute. The story isn't that the Americans have arrested a soldier. The story's in the 4th paragraph. The soldier has unloaded this huge pile of secrets. It's a bit like the Yanukovych leaks that were found in the sea. Go and grab them. They're out. This Australian guy has got this huge quantity of secrets. And it's an extraordinary commentary on flat earth news that newspapers all over the world published that story, but didn't look at the 4th paragraph and go, hang on a minute, there's an enormous story sitting out there waiting to be got. So I caught up with Julian, who I'd never met before, in Brussels. And well, let me come to that in a moment. But what I'm trying to say at this stage is those are two really, really big stories. And it didn't involve having clever contacts in the car park. And it certainly didn't involve recycling PR crap. It's about thinking in a particular way to spot what isn't there, what must be missing, something that's wrong, and then using your imagination, okay? So if we move on from there and think about research, I think it's helpful to think of the research that we do as being along 2 primary routes. So first of all, there's the public domain, which is everything that you're entitled to know simply because you ask. And that's got much bigger than it used to be. So it used to be things like official records to which we had legitimate access. But partly, do you have freedom of information law in Slovenia? So lots and lots of countries have those laws now. That increases the public domain a little bit. And of course, the internet expands it enormously. But what is a horrible danger in the world of flat earth news, of under-resourced newsrooms, is that young journalists sit chained to their keyboards and imagine that research equals Google. That's what you do to try and find out what's true, to just rummage around in the internet. The internet's very limited. Google's very limited. It doesn't tell you everything that's even out there on the internet, a Google search. And even if you discovered everything that was on the internet, it doesn't give you access to lots of those old-fashioned public records. It wouldn't give you access to what the Freedom of Information Act would want. But don't get trapped by Google. Google's delicious, but don't imagine that's the whole game. It isn't. With the big stories, the public domain really never gives you what you want. Am I going too fast for you? You following? Okay. There's an old maxim in British journalism that news is what someone somewhere doesn't want you to know. It's the opposite of the press release. And if someone somewhere doesn't want you to know this stuff, you are not going to find it in the public domain. So sooner or later, when you want the memo that was written by the civil servant to the minister, when you want the tax returns of the wealthy man who's cheating us all with his taxes, when you want anything that's secret, when you want to know what's going on in an intelligence agency, you have to get yourself a human being. And I think the most interesting, important, difficult area of reporting is that, working with human sources. That's where the most interesting of the subtle skills are. And again, I think that the way to approach these human sources is by using your imagination. So first of all, there's a very simple preliminary thing, which is to find who are the sources who we could possibly get the story from. And there you just let your imagination run riot. And never ever, when you're using your journalistic imagination, never listen to the internal voice that says, that can't be true, or that won't work. The wonderful thing about your imagination is that everything is possible. So at this stage, if I give you an example, I did a lot of work investigating the tax affairs of a very wealthy man. So if you let your imagination run riot, who could possibly know the truth about this man's finances and the tax he pays, which is inherently quite secret stuff? You just let your imagination run riot. Well, members of his family might know, his accountant would know, the tax authorities would know. Don't listen to the voice that says those people won't speak to you. Everybody's going to speak to us in a moment. We'll see. And so his people who worked in his house might know. People who've worked for him at any stage might know. And you just write a list of all those people who could conceivably know the truth about this man's tax affairs. And then what you do is you simply write a list and you take the easy ones first. So if, for example, there have been people who have worked for him, who you can trace. They're fairly easy to approach. You knock on a door and you get them to talk. And it's always the same way with these investigations. People worry about how to start, whether or not they're starting in the right place. I think it's helpful to visualize it, that you're on the edge of a circle. And it doesn't matter whether you go in here or there or there, the distance to the center is the same. So the idea is always start with the easy stuff. You go to the front door of the house before you creep round into the back garden and climb up a drain post and go through the window. Do easy things, whatever they are. And then what you'll find is once you get one person to speak, supposing you get a former employee of the rich man, that employee will say, actually, there was another guy who got sacked and he was very angry. So then you go and see this person. And then he says, well, I know something else. And you get passed on down a chain. Just start anywhere and you'll get to the center. So in the case of the phone hacking, you throw your imagination out. Who could possibly know the truth about what's going on? And so you go for former journalists who've worked for the News of the World and da-di-da-di-da. I want to go on to the next thing, which is this. The most important single question in reporting is how can I persuade this person to talk to me when they don't want to? Because, if you remember, news is what someone somewhere doesn't want you to know. The people who have the truth tend to feel that they're under pressure, that if they talk, they will be sacked or arrested or beaten up or divorced or whatever it is. So if you can persuade those people to talk to you when they've already decided not to, you're the person that gets the story and everybody else wanders away with nothing. And it's the most exciting moment in reporting, when you pitch up on a doorstep and on the other side of this piece of wood, this door, there is this human being who knows that they're not going to talk to you. And the door opens, and in the 10 seconds you have before they decide to close it, you say something strong enough that you change the way they're thinking. And you get in, and then 2 or 3 hours later you come out and your notebook is full of notes and your hand is aching because you've written down so much. But you've done it, you've cracked this story. So I think, again, this is all to do with imagination. It's to do with before you go to the doorstep to bang on a door, I would say before you pick up the phone, even to speak to the most boring press officer of some boring organization, just stop and think, what does the world look like to this person? And above all, what does it feel like? What's going on emotionally in this person? So that you can try to hit some emotional button when you start talking to them, which will provoke them into talking, even if they didn't want to. It's about imagining their emotional life and what's going on in their head. You imagine a kind of narrative of events. We know that such and such is happening. What's he or she feeling now? What are they worried about? What do they want? Who do they want to see? Who are they frightened of seeing? What's going on in their heads and hearts? And then think of something you can say that hits the button. So come back to the WikiLeaks thing. So we've had this hang on a minute moment. There's all these secrets out there. This is terribly simple stuff, isn't it? There's this huge cache of secrets. Okay, so I spent 3 or 4 days phoning round anybody who'd worked for WikiLeaks. That's also very simple because their names are in newspaper stories that have been published already about WikiLeaks in Iceland and Amsterdam and various other places, I can't remember where. But so in the end, one of them says, okay, do not tell Julian I told you this, but he's in Brussels. And he's going to be at the European Parliament at 1 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. So, first of all, I call our correspondent in Brussels. He goes and finds Julian at 1 o'clock and says, will you meet this idiot Nicka Davies? And he says, yeah. Okay, so the next day I'm going out on the train and I'm trying to do this thing. How can I persuade this guy to give me this information? And from the outset, you can see it's a little bit difficult. He's not mainstream media. He doesn't trust us at all. He's probably one of those people who thinks we are all corporate puppets. We're not his obvious allies. His intention, his pattern so far, has been to take secret information and put it on the website in the hope that people will download it and make sense of it. So what can we do? What's he thinking? What's he feeling? So we know that this soldier Bradley Manning has been arrested. So one of the things you can easily guess is that he must be feeling pretty worried about whether he is going to be the next target of the American operation that's arrested Bradley Manning. So he may be worried about being arrested. He may be worried about being physically attacked. He may be frightened of having the website disabled. There's fear there. So one of the things that we present to people is power. The mainstream media still have power. So on the way, and I thought the other thought that was in my mind in this train is not to play the part of the greedy journalist, saying, I want your story. Again, the Yanukovych leaks was interesting. For those who heard it, the way that the journalists collaborated and shared and didn't behave like greedy gits. So So there it is, thinking all this stuff on the train. How can I motivate this guy? What's he thinking? So if what he's thinking is fear, somehow I can allay his fear. So I caught up with Julian, we sat down in a cafe, and we talked for 6 hours. Julian is a very likable guy, very intelligent, and funny too. He has a really good sense of humor, and I enjoyed talking to him. And the conversation began like this. Is it right that you've got all these secrets? He says, yes. So I said, well, what have you got? So he says, well, I have the complete record of every operation conducted by the American military in Afghanistan since they went in there in October 2001. Fuck. So anything else? He said, yeah, well, I've got the record of every single operation conducted by the American military in Iraq since they went in there in March 2003. I said, holy moly. Anything else? He said, yes, I have an enormous archive of messages, cables, sent by American embassies all over the world, sending messages back to Washington, D.C. That goes back as far as 1968. I'm ready to fall off my chair. It's huge. And furthermore, he has the personal files of all the prisoners in Guantanamo Bay. I mean, so it's like those Yanukovych files. This is just like huge, huge amount of material. So then we talked, and the way in which I approached it was not trying not to be the greedy journalist and trying to help him with his fear. To say, the way to protect yourself and the way to make best use of this material is to create an alliance of mainstream media so that, first of all, we will go through the raw material and we will convert this raw data into stories. We'll give them meaning. Secondly, if we put them out on our websites, which have millions and millions of people hitting them, far more than the WikiLeaks websites, we'll get impact. And then beyond that, any newspaper tends to have a kind of network of followers which amounts to a kind of political alliance of people who read the newspaper in the political world and who support it. So you get some kind of political cover. And the more we push it out, the higher we go, the bigger the stories, the more impossible it gets for them to have a go at you in any way, whether physically or legally or technologically, do you see? So it's an attempt to try to solve his problems and help him out. Again, like I said at the beginning, this is not magic. It's extraordinarily simple, this stuff, but what you're seeing with it is you're opening up. I mean, that probably was the biggest news story in the world that year. Just by doing silly, simple things that any of us can do. And there may be better ways of doing it. I feel a little bit deferential, you know, a bit cautious about telling you that my way is the right way. It's just my way. So, and it's interesting, the more you think about dealing with human sources and motivating, it gets quite interesting. So some of it is obvious. When you're approaching human sources, you look for conflict. So I have a friend who approached a woman who had recently divorced from a senior politician. And it was clear she was at huge conflict with her former husband, and she knew a great deal about his history of financial corruption. And it was fairly easy to push that emotional button so that she unloaded information and destroyed his political career. And that was right. He deserved to have his political career destroyed, not because he'd been horrid to his wife, but because he was corrupt. So you look always for conflict. Journalists can move in where there's conflict. I think there's a funny thing about how, maybe with Julian and a lot of people think we have great power. We don't actually have as much power as perhaps we would like. It's that I often say this, that the fantasy that gets reporters out of bed in the morning is that if we see a bad thing and write about it, the bad thing will stop. Actually, that isn't what happens. We see the bad thing, we write about it, the people who are responsible for the bad thing get terribly angry and make threats, and then they carry on as ever. That's basically the pattern. But the point is that in approaching people, they will perceive us as having power to solve their problems. I don't want to be too cynical about this, but it is something that you can use on the doorstep when you're trying to motivate people to talk to you. I think there's just a few other thoughts about this. It's very easy in a cynical world to lose track of the fact that lots of people still think in a moral way. So doing the phone hacking story, there were journalists who had worked for Rupert Murdoch's News of the World who cooperated and really, really helped because they believed it was wrong that a newspaper should break the law, and particularly that it should break the law to do stories which were invading people's bedrooms and ruining their lives, not even important stories. This is an example of, no, I won't do that. But just look for the moral motive is what I'm saying. There are moral people out there. My experience is that very often public officials, civil servants, will think in a moral way. If a man or a woman is working for a government department, so I came across this, for example, the government department in Britain that looks after the police and crime, what we call the Home Office. You get the minister comes in, he's been elected, he's a politician, he wants to be popular. And so he gets very, very tough, and let's have longer prison sentences and more police on the street. But the civil servant who's working there knows that if you want to waste police time, you should put policemen on the street wandering around on the off chance that they might bump into a bit of crime. It's a ludicrous waste of money, but politicians like doing it because that's what the public want. So the public official will see that, know the truth, and work with a journalist secretly to try to stop the politician doing that. It's a moral motive, that's all it is, and they take risks and we look after them. Well, there's one other thing to mention, which is that I think nobody ever thinks that they themselves are bad. So if we could interview Hitler about the final solution, about the massacre of Jews and communists and gypsies, he would have arranged the facts in his mind so that it was acceptable. I had a strange experience years ago. I was looking at British paedophiles who had moved to Amsterdam to get away from a little bit of legal trouble in Britain, and they had kind of commercialized their sexual obsession. And one of the things that they were doing was to produce videos of children, usually young boys, well under 16 years old, being fucked. You know, quite heavy stuff. And there's lots of work on it, using exactly these things I'm talking about, using your imagination to find sources, using your imagination to motivate people. And one of the people in Amsterdam who was very helpful gave me the name of the guy who was then the biggest producer of child pornography in Holland, which probably means, because Holland was the core in those days of the world industry, that he was probably the biggest producer in the world. This is a guy called Rudy van Dam, and he gave me the address. And so I went and knocked on Rudy's door down in Utrecht. And it was strange, actually, because when the door opened, it all went completely wrong. The man who came to the door was like a sort of university professor, very nicely dressed, with his glasses on a string, like an academic has, rather long, trendy grey hair. And I said, I'm looking for Rudy van Dam. Oh, Rudy left this house a long time ago. Well, so it's worth trying to see whether you can motivate this person to help. So I tried my little piece of stuff that I had prepared for Rudy on this guy. And after 5 or 10 minutes, he said, well, okay, I am Rudy, come in. So we go into the house. And the house is very sort of bourgeois, North European. We go into his dining room. There's a dark wood dining room table and stiff-backed wooden chairs around it. And he sits there, and I sit here. And at the end of the room, behind Rudy, there was a sideboard or table with some video equipment on it, 2 monitor screens and a VCR machine. And although the sound was turned down, the pictures were still playing. Pictures of boys being fucked. This is an extraordinary thing, that he knew very well that I was a journalist. And he was sitting there, he knew very well that I could see it. But he didn't mind, because in his mind, he had rearranged the whole thing so that there was nothing wrong with doing what he did. He had a whole, you will often find this with paedophiles, a whole theory about how children have sexuality and that they deserve to be liberated, and that the position of the paedophile now is the same as the position of the homosexual, let's say in 1930, that it's a love that dare not speak its name. I'm not expecting you to accept that, but I'm just trying to say that if this is true, that nobody ever really thinks they're bad, it's quite amazing how many people will speak to us about bad things they do, because they've rearranged them in their head so that Hitler would talk to you about the final solution, just as Rudy talked about his work. So all this is worth bearing in mind when you're trying to think, how can I motivate this person to talk to me? What else should we talk about? So hang on, where was I going? Research, public domain. Okay, so then if you think, we go back, I was talking about research. You have the public domain, and you have these human sources. Constantly use your imagination. What could the truth possibly be? Who could possibly know it? How can I get them to talk to me? Those are the 3 questions that drive, I think, all this reporting. But there are other little routes that you can use to get information. So there's the business of going undercover. Now it's funny, if you talk to young student journalists, if you give them an imaginary story and say, okay, how are you going to research it? They all want to go undercover. In 2 minutes, they're all dressing up as milkmen and disappearing. And I think that's the opposite of what we should do. I think going undercover is really the last resort. It's the last thing you should do. It's time-consuming. It tends to be expensive because it's time-consuming. If you're going into really nasty people, it's physically dangerous. it's a bad move. There's a lot of pressure sometimes put on people in television to do undercover work, because it means you can get pictures, not just information. But if any of you are put under that pressure, I would seriously ask yourself, is this really the only way I can get this story? Because on the whole, these other things I'm talking about will work quicker and cheaper and safer than going undercover. I've only, I think, tried to go undercover once in my whole life, and there I made a bad mistake because I allowed somebody else to do my thinking for me. It was odd, actually. I had a lunch break in London, and I was wandering around St. Paul's Cathedral. It's not that I'm religious, but there's something fascinating about a building as old as that. And there was an art exhibition in the cathedral of paintings done by prisoners. And one of the prisoners who was involved in the exhibition came up to me, and he was one of those people who speaks at about 400 words a minute, chappa, 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 really bundle of nerves. He was called Nicky. And this is years ago, but he told me that there was a group of people he was involved with who were dealing heroin in South London. Now, this is in the days before heroin washed its way through the housing estates all over the UK. Heroin was unusual. This is like 1985, I think. So he said that he could introduce me into this group of heroin dealers, and I could see exactly what they were doing and write about them. And he suggested that I should pretend to be a businessman who was going bust, and therefore I needed to make a drugs deal in order to make money to save my business. So this was the story he gave me, which was okay in its way. But the problem was he also gave me a name. He said, okay, your name is Kevin. It just so happens I don't like the name Kevin. I just think it sort of sounds dull. Nick's not great, but Kevin's worse. So a day or two later, I go to this pub in South London. There's me and Nicky and all these guys who are kind of wandering around with active criminal written on their forehead. They're just sort of acting the part, playing pool. And Nicky says, this is Kevin. He wants to talk to you about something. Okay, Kev, you sit there. So after about half an hour, another one came in, another one of these active criminals, and he said, hi. And I said, hi, my name's Nick. Oh, fuck. I'd forgotten my own name. And I had to do a whole lot of very fast thinking to say, well, actually, my name is Nick, but I wanted you to think it was Kevin because I want to make a deal with you, and I didn't want you to know, oh, fuck, let me get out of here. And actually, then it got even more complicated because a day or two later, I had a call from a really nice detective who said, I understand you were in this pub in South London. Would you get the fuck out of there, because one of those people is an undercover detective and you're getting in the way. So it was really complicated. So I learned the lesson. I shouldn't go undercover, and so I'm saying it's a last resort. Okay. But there's other, so apart from those two primary routes, right, public domain, human sources, going undercover is there if you have to. There's another thing which over the years I've done, which is to start a legal action. Again, I don't know whether this works in Slovenia. In Britain, the courts have the power to order an organization, a person, to disclose material into the court. So if you can't get the material yourself, if you can start a court action, you can get it in. So I've done this a couple of times in the past, and I did it with the phone hacking. So just so you understand, we started publishing stories about crime at the news of the world. We being the Guardian. We were horribly isolated. With one or two tiny and courageous exceptions, other newspapers would not cover this story. Maybe because they were owned by Rupert Murdoch. Well, they weren't going to write about him. Or because if they weren't owned by Rupert Murdoch, they were also committing the same crimes. Or because they were politically in favour of the Conservative Party. And you may know that the man who was editing the News of the World when the worst of these crimes happened had left and gone to work for David Cameron, the leader of the Conservatives. So we were very isolated. And furthermore, the police were attacking us. They had come out publicly. And you remember, they're sitting on this evidence of all this crime, but they came out publicly repeatedly and said that the Guardian was wrong. The head of the police came to see my editor and said, you've got to stop Nick writing these ridiculous stories. My editor is a good guy. He ignored him. So we were under a lot of pressure. And the Murdoch company had put out a statement accusing us of lying to the British people. And that had gone through their newspapers and on their television channel. And I had a bad experience one evening. I got into a taxi in London, and London taxi drivers, they like to talk. What do you do? So I said, well, I'm a journalist. What sort of stuff are you doing? So I said, well, I've been doing this phone hacking at the News of the World. And the taxi driver said, oh, yeah, that all turned out to be wrong, didn't it? You think, oh, fuck. Anyway, so I did something which in a way is quite controversial. This is about starting legal actions, that I intervened in the events that I was covering. So by talking to journalists who had worked for the News of the World, the people with the moral motive, I could identify some of those public figures who had been hacked. And then I could approach those people, actors or politicians, and say, I know you were a victim of this thing. Now, can I hook you up with one of the lawyers who knows how to take this kind of case to court? Because if you go to court, they'll pay you damages, but most important, the judge, with all the power that a judge has, can order the police to hand over the evidence they have, can order the Murdoch company to hand over the evidence. So that is one of the things that enabled us to uncover this story, was using this other route. I'm trying to describe these other routes to get information, that you can get a court on side and use its power. It's controversial because you are changing the course of events which you're reporting. I'm happy to have done it, and I'm perfectly happy to tell you about it. It's in the book that I wrote, because it's done in order to get information about crime that's being concealed. There was one other thing that we did that was slightly unusual, which was, normally if you have an exclusive story, you keep it to yourself. Because we were so isolated, my editor started giving away information to other news outlets. Not in Britain, the newspapers wouldn't cover it. But he contacted the New York Times, editor to editor, and said, there's a great story here. It's got Prince William and his knee. It's got the private investigators. It's got tabloid journalists. It's got Rupert Murdoch. It's got abuse of power. And of course, the other thing is in New York, the New York Times is being threatened and attacked by the Wall Street Journal, which has been bought by Rupert Murdoch. So that was probably another reason why they thought it was worth pursuing. So they sent 3 journalists over to London. And I spent a couple of days giving them information, background stuff and contacts and phone numbers, and introducing them to 1 or 2 off-the-record sources. And it feels weird, but it worked, because they then went and did their own work. Big, powerful newspaper. They dug up very important new information and took the story forward. And also they confirmed what we had said so far. So there's all these different routes that you can use. I know I've got to stop in a moment, because we've got to stop at 10:02. So I think we can talk more through there, but is that right? There's a rule in Le Piano that you always do what Anushka tells you. Well, okay, maybe I just need to say one more thing, which is, I started off telling you about how, Flat Earth News, and we work for these organizations that won't let us do our job properly, and I was talking about those tabloid newspapers in Britain that were doing terrible things. Those terrible things actually make it more difficult for any journalist in Britain to do the job, because when you turn up on somebody's doorstep, they're expecting you to lie, cheat, steal, do terrible things, or bribe them, which also makes it very difficult. But actually, if you look at the other end of the telescope, journalism is still a fantastic profession to be in, even with all of those problems. Because, even at the most basic level, we get paid to go and see interesting things and talk to interesting people. Whether you're the music critic being sent to see a rock concert, or sports being sent to see sports, or politically you're put into the front row seat, you can see it all happen, or the crime reporter. There were big riots in London when I was starting off, and I was in the middle of them. Well, not quite in the middle, because I'm a bit of a coward, but I got front row seat on the news as it's happening. So that's fascinating. And then as you climb the ladder and you get a little bit more power, and the news editor will let you take some time on stories, you get to do this thing of hurting bad people, which is quite satisfying. And so I just think that we should not listen to people who say we're all corporate puppets. We know we're not. Journalism has always attracted bright, idealistic people who want to make the world a better place, like all of you. And we deserve to be here. If the internet kills off journalism, as conceivably it could, they're going to miss us. It's no substitute to say, if professional journalists go, then citizen journalists will come in and do the job for them. Any more than if your doctor leaves, you would get your neighbour to look after your health and give you a heart operation. It ain't going to work. To do journalism properly, you need skills, this strange business of technique that we're talking about, and you need resources. And you need accountability, to put your name on a story, and to be accountable if you get it wrong. All these things are important. The citizen journalists have none of this. And there's an enormous amount of citizen journalism, people blogging and tweeting, which is somewhere between bullshit and madness. Just awful. So what I'm trying to say is that we should enjoy being journalists, and we should be proud of being journalists, because it still is a great profession, and it matters an awful lot. Okay, thank you for listening to me.